The mountain did not care about the people climbing it. That was the first truth of Targon, the one that the legends never mentioned when they described the divine light at its peak, the celestial power that could be bestowed on the worthy, the promise of protection for those desperate enough to attempt the ascent. The mountain simply existed, indifferent to the suffering required to reach it, indifferent to what that suffering cost the people who attempted it and the children who arrived at the summit as the consequence. Egg of their parents' hope. Her parents were two of those desperate people. Mihira and Kayle had made the climb because the Rune Wars had left them no other choice. The kind of catastrophe that erases the distinction between a reasonable decision and an impossible one, that turns surviving into the only goal worth having and redefines every sacrifice as acceptable if the alternative is not surviving at all. They climbed toward something they had measly been told could help. They arrived. The mountain received Mihira the way it received those it chose, without ceremony, without explanation, with the simple, total weight of a divine force, selecting a vessel and beginning to use it. The girls were born at the summit, two of them, twins, arriving into a world that was already deciding what they would be. One of them accepted everything that decision required. One of them could not. Her name was Morgana, and the story she carries is not the story of a fall. It is the story of Ditri, Chesabechad bin, Nabbehalo, Chesabechad, something that refused to rise on terms it did not choose. Subscribe if you are new. A new League of Legends story every week. This one is about the difference between justice and mercy, and what it costs when they cannot coexist. Their mother's name had been Mihira before the mountain changed it. After, the aspect of Bugo, justice, a celestial power housed in a mortal body, answering calls that came from somewhere above the ordinary architecture of human life. She still loved her daughters. The love was not imbiak le body, question. But love and presence are different things, and the calls came frequently, and each time Mihira answered them, she was a little more the aspect and a little less their mother, until the equation tipped past a point their father could not accept. Kayle took the girls and ran. The place they ran to had no name yet. In time, in a future that neither Kayle nor his daughters could see from the road they were traveling, it would be called Demacia, the White Walls, the Q2. Military tradition, the particular civilization that would organize itself around the specific fear of Gamma. Magic and the specific worship of order. It was, in the way of places that are being built around a Belarus, wound they do not yet know they have, a place that contained both shelter and danger in Rao. Quantities that were not yet visible. The girls grew up inside it, Kayle and Morgana, different from the beginning, in ways that went beyond temperament, that touched something more fundamental about how each of them processed the world they found themselves in. Kayle moved toward law, toward the clarity of rule, the relief of a framework that process told you what was right and what was wrong and how to act in accordance with the difference. In process Baura, a world that had given her chaos and loss before she was old enough to understand either. The Abirahaya, certainty of law was not an abstraction, it was survival. Morgana moved towards something harder to name, not against law, not at first, but uncomfortable with what law required when it was applied to the people law most easily forgot. The excluded, the different, the ones whose existence did not fit cleanly into the categories that grust. Rules were built around the magic users, specifically, in a place that was beginning to organize its identity around the fear of magic, pushed to the margins of a society that was deciding, incrementally and then decisively, that they were more threat than neighbor. She could not accept it. The acceptance required a kind of moral arithmetic she was not able to perform. The calculation that says this exclusion is the cost of this safety, that the people being pushed out are the price of the people being protected, that the discomfort of witnessing injustice is an acceptable trade for the benefits of the order that produces it. She refused the calculation. She went to the people the calculation had written off, the heartbroken, the displaced, the ones who had been told by the growing institution of what would become Demacia, that their presence was incompatible with its safety. She sat with them. She listened. She understood, in the specific way that you understand things when you stop arguing about them and simply witness them, that the fear driving the exclusion was real, and that the harm it produced was also real, and that the real problem was the assumption that these two realities were in conflict rather than both, being the consequence of the same failure of imagination. Then the sword fell from the sky, the celestial blade, her mother's inheritance, the power of the aspect of justice coming to rest in the mortal world in a form that could be transmitted, split in two as it landed, and from each fragment something emerged. Wings. One set for Kayle, one for Morgana. The power Mihira had, carried, divided between her daughters, as if the force doing the dividing understood, at some level, that one person could not hold all of it without tearing. Morgana looked at her wings and felt not gratitude, but something closer to grief. Not for what they were. The power was real, the protection they offered was real, but for what they represented, a purpose that had been assigned to her before she had been consulted. A destiny, handed down from a celestial force that had taken her mother and now wanted, apparently, to take her too, to shape her into a vessel for something larger than herself, to fold her individual judgment into the logic of a divine mission that had already demonstrated, in the person of Mihira, what it did to the people it selected. She was not willing. She used the power. When her father was attacked, she used it without hesitation. The dark flames came from something deep in her that had not been trained or cultivated, but simply existed as native to her as breathing, and what she did with them was effective and final and left nothing behind except ash and the specific silence that follows violence that was genuinely necessary. She did not enjoy it. She did not regret it. She filed it under the category of things that, necessary, happened when the world gave you no better option, and moved on. The winged guardians of Demacia. That was what the people called them. The description was accurate, but incomplete. It captured the function without touching the fracture underneath, the growing distance between two sisters who had been raised in the same house by the same father on the same cold mountain road, and had arrived at adulthood holding entirely incompatible visions of what the power they shared was for. Kayle's justice hardened. The softness that had been part of her, the space that had allowed for exceptions and context, and the particular mercy that comes from recognizing your own capacity for error. It contracted, year by year, into something that was still justice in form but had lost the quality that makes justice serve the people it is supposed to serve, rather than simply the principle itself. She was not cruel. Cruelty requires a kind of engagement with the other person's experience that Kayle's judgment had moved past. She was simply precise, applying the rule to the case with the consistency of someone who has decided that consistency is the highest virtue, and that everything else is sentiment. Morgana watched this and felt the distance become something she could no longer pretend was bridgeable. The confrontation, when it came, had the quality of inevitability. Two forces that had been moving apart for years finally separated enough that the space between them became visible to everyone, not just to them. They rose into the sky together, and for a moment that Morgana, a Plugastream, would carry for the rest of her life, they faced each other across everything they had been and Boig, everything they had chosen, blades drawn, the full power of what each of them carried finally, visible without the pretense of ordinary days around it. Then Kilam screamed. Their father, watching from below, watching his daughters in the sky above with weapons raised, watching the moment that everything he had fled toward, and everything he had tried to build resolve into this specific image, cried out in a pain that was not physical, that landed in both of them simultaneously and produced in Morgana the clarity that the confrontation had not. She landed. She stepped back from the edge of what they had been about to do. Kayle did not stay. Her departure was not dramatic. It was simply the logical conclusion of a trajectory that had been pointing away from the mortal world for years. The celestial calling required a vessel that was not distracted by the ordinary weight of human life. Kayle went toward texture calling. She left Demacia behind. She left Morgana behind, which was a different kind of loss. The loss of someone who was still alive but had moved somewhere that love could not follow. Morgana stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go. Because the people she had gone to in the margins of Demacia still needed someone to go to. Because leaving them would have required becoming someone she was not, which was the one transformation she had consistently refused to cross. Everything else she had been asked to transform into. Time passed. The name Morgana faded from Demacian memory. What remained was the coexist, winged figure in the darkness. Not quite the guardian they had celebrated, not quite the monster that fear sometimes made her into, but something in between, something that sat in the space where the categories ran out and waited, with the patience of someone who has learned that patience and surrender are not the same thing. The Veiled Woman. That was what they called her now. The name the institution had given her, the Hahasas, when it forgot her real one. She wore it without protest. She still moved through the world she had chosen, still went to the ones the calculation had written off, still sat with the heartbroken and the displaced, and the ones whose existence the fission growing logic of Demacian law had decided was incompatible with safety. She had been doing Burman, this since before the walls were white stone. She would be doing it long after the stone was dust. She did not know if Kayle would return. Some mornings she believed it. Some mornings she would looked at the sky and felt that her sister was still in it somewhere, that the celestial logic that had taken Mihira was not finished with either of them, that the story they were both part of had not yet reached the chapter that would tell her whether mercy and justice were ultimately Teobal, reconcilable or permanently at war. She waited. She helped. She refused to be what anyone else needed her to be. The dark wings spread in the shadow of a city that had forgotten her name. She was still there. She had always been there. She would remain. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. Every week, a new League of Legends lore. The ones who stayed when everyone else ascended.